It's good to see everybody tonight. We are going to briefly review on the Exodus, and then we will move into our next Bible time period, wandering in the wilderness. These three, that is the Exodus, the wandering, and the invasion and conquest, in my mind, and especially wandering and invasion, are the hardest for me to remember. There's a lot packed into these time periods, and they're just, I still don't have them memorized. I can recall bits and pieces, but if I don't go through these on a regular basis, it escapes me. There are a couple more later that are a little bit that way, but these are this is where we're at. So I don't want you to get frustrated or discouraged with yourself in this process. Again, we're just trying to familiarize ourselves with the content of these Bible time periods so that we have a big picture view of the scriptures, and we have an idea of where major events fit in the overall scheme of things. So what I want to do first is run back through the Exodus and just briefly review what we covered over the course of actually the last couple of weeks, because we didn't do a lot of new material last week. And then we'll move into our next Bible time period. So what I want to do, what I would like for you to do as much as possible, okay? I realize that this is asking. I'd like for you to ignore your notes, okay? Turn them upside down, put something over top of them, put blinders under your eyes, whatever the case may be. But I want you to ignore your notes. Don't take the next 10 seconds and try to cram. Okay? We're not keeping score, okay? But as a group, I'm not going to put any individual on the spot, but as a group, I'd like us to see if we can reconstruct the bullet points from the period of the Exodus. All right. So to me, the easiest way is to think about the connection with our previous Bible time period. All right. So if we need to, and that's really true of all of them. All right. Where were we when we last left off with the previous Bible time period? All right. Well, that's where we're going to pick up with this Bible time period. So what's the Bible time period that is before the Exodus?
Flood? Or no?
Patriarchs.
Yeah.
All right, the patriarchs. All right. So the patriarchs are pretty easy because those are names and stories that we're probably more familiar with than most. Sorry. When we talk about the patriarchs, well, let's just review those bullet points because there are 4. We can do that really quickly. What are they?
Abraham,
Isaac,
Jacob,
and
Joseph.
one more.
Joseph, and Esau.
Okay, all right. So the story of Joseph, right? So when we get to the end of the story of Joseph, where is the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph?
Egypt.
They're in Egypt, right? They've gone down to Egypt. So eventually, as this family grew in Egypt, rather than just being a family that was living in Egypt, what had they become by the time we get to the beginning of the book of Exodus?
Were they still really powerful at that time?
Well, they were at the end of the book of Genesis, but then you kind of fast forward between the end of the book of Genesis and the beginning of the book of Exodus. When Exodus opens, what were they?
Slaves.
They were slaves. So that's where we start. We start with Israel in bondage. Right?
Will you give me my Jane?
All right. Get mine too, please, Diana. All right. So we start off with Israel in bondage. Okay. And see, now she mutes it because I embarrassed her. Okay. So we start with Israel in bondage. Okay. All right. So now, but this is the story of what? The Bible time period is
The Exodus.
the Exodus. All right. What is Exodus?
Leaving
Leaving. Who's leaving?
the Israelites
Where?
out of Egypt.
Egypt. All right. All right. So maybe we need to back up and get that big picture. All right. Now, so we start off with Israel in bondage. Who is the main character of this Bible time period?
Moses.
Moses. So what would be the next point in this time period?
His birth.
All right, the birth of Moses. All right, the birth of Moses. Now, we've got to get Moses ready to be the main character, to do everything that Moses does. The first 40 years of his life was spent how?
In a position of power, the son of
All right.
Pharaoh's daughter.
That's right. He was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now, did that put him in a position where his fellow Hebrews, his fellow Israelites were ready to say, yes, Moses, lead us out of Egypt? When he was about 40 years old, what happened?
He killed the guard, the centurion, or the guard.
Okay, he killed the Egyptian. He tried to create a dispute between two of his fellow Hebrews, and he was, as a consequence, rejected by his people. And so, he'd killed an Egyptian. He figured that was going to be found out. He was going to be punished accordingly. So what did he do next?
Flee to the wilderness.
He fled to the wilderness. He fled to the wilderness of Midian. That's where he met his wife. That's where he worked for his father-in-law as a shepherd, and he spent about 40 years there. Now, what turned him from Midian back to Egypt to lead the Exodus of Israel?
God spoke to him in the burning bush.
The events of the burning bush. That's exactly right. So he goes back and he knocks on Pharaoh's door and says, hey, I'm here to take all of your slave labor out of Egypt. That didn't exactly go very well. Pharaoh had to be persuaded, and that took a series of
Plagues.
the 10
10
plagues. So ultimately, with the last plague, which was what? What was the last plague?
Firstborn
Death of the
died.
firstborn.
The death of the firstborn. Pharaoh was persuaded to let them leave Egypt. They are leaving Egypt. Pharaoh changes his mind, chases them down, and catches up to them where?
Crossing the Red Sea.
Let's see.
At the Red Sea. And that's where you have their miraculous deliverance, the parting of the waters, the crossing of the Red Sea. After they cross the Red Sea, they are journeying. Where are they headed?
Sinai.
That's their first major stop after the Red Sea. So the trip to Sinai, and then you have all of the events at Mount Sinai. We separate that because there's a lot of little stories that fit in between the Red Sea and Sinai. And then at Sinai, about how long were they at Mount Sinai? Do you remember?
13 months.
It was about a year. I was thinking it was just under a year, Diana, but I may be mistaken about that. About a year. I have to go back and look at that. Let me think. I can't think right off the top of my head. I'll have to look at that. But about a year. All right. So you have the events at Mount Sinai. You have all of that that's involved there: the giving of the law, the building of the tabernacle, the construction of the tabernacle, and the setup of the priesthood, and all of that kind of thing. All right. So now they leave Mount Sinai. What's their ultimate goal? Big goal. Canaan. All right. But they're on their way to Canaan, and they stop just on the edge of Canaan, just on the edge of the promised land. Where is that?
Kadesh.
Kadesh Barnea.
Kadesh Barnea. All right. And from Kadesh, what did they do?
Spies out.
Send in some spies.
They sent spies into the land.
Oh, yeah.
Joshua and Caleb came back and said, yes, the Lord's going to give us this great land. But the other 10 spies came back and said, nope, there's no way we can conquer it. And so which of the spies did the people of Israel believe?
Okay.
The naysayers.
The naysayers. And Israel refused to go into the land. So even if you don't remember, and there's nothing magical about the wording of these bullet points, but even if you don't remember this precise wording that we've put on the screen, that's not the important part. The important part is you just told the story of the Exodus. That's the important part. and even if you were telling this story and you skipped something, actually before that this happened, you would remember. And so you have that big picture. I'm reviewing that with you to say, don't underestimate your capacity to know and remember this information. You a lot of this you have grown up hearing these stories. You've read the Bible. You know what's going on here, and so it's a lot, and it can be a challenge. But don't underestimate your ability to tell these stories and to share that. So that's great. That's great. All right, let's move on to our next Bible time period.
Jeremy, I have a question.
Okay.
Quickly, have you ever seen anything on the window or the time frame of the 10 plagues? How long that lasted from 1 to 10?
We talked about that, didn't we, in a Bible study a while back?
Yeah, I mean, there are some of the plagues that it says, it lasted this long, or that there's some time, measure that is mentioned. Excuse me. But there is not about all of them, and I don't think there's any way to reconstruct and to say, it lasts, the whole series of 10 plagues lasted this long. I just don't, I don't know what that would be. That would give us that indication. Right now, I'm a little bit perplexed and troubled by the time that the length of time they spent at Mount Sinai, and why I can't remember that is really troubling to me. They stayed there long enough to celebrate the Passover. before they left. That is Numbers. I was looking to see what chapter it was. That's Numbers chapter 9. And then they left. So with the Passover, that marks 1 year from the time that they left Egypt. And then they left shortly after that.
I think that might be what I was thinking of in terms of 13 months, was maybe they left 13 months after they had left Egypt.
Yeah, and that's the key to it. Is thank you for saying that, Diana, because that just reminded me of Exodus chapter 19. Tells us in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone up out of the land of Egypt. So you've got the passing of a couple of months between the last plague and them leaving Egypt and their arrival in the wilderness of Sinai. As soon as you said that, I remembered Exodus 19 verse 1. That's the key. So you've got a couple of months that pass to get them from Egypt to Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
And then you have all of the events at Sinai, the celebration of the second Passover, and then them leaving. And if I'm not mistaken, this is Leviticus, Numbers 10 tells us the second year and the month. Numbers 10 verse 11. The second year in the second month, on the 20th of the month, the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. So it's like 11 months, maybe actually a little bit more than that. The thing is, Exodus 19 verse 1 isn't absolutely clear. It just says in the 3rd month. So, at what point in that 3rd month did they actually get to Sinai? That's the question. So it's right around a year, or maybe just under a year, that they were at Sinai. Have we thoroughly confused everybody now? Did everybody follow that? So Exodus 19, verse, the two key passages, let me nutshell this since I've chased every rabbit getting there. The two key passages to establishing this chronology are Exodus 19, verse 1, and Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. Okay, so, and if you didn't follow all that, it's Diana's fault because she brought it up. Okay, so let's talk about wandering in the wilderness. Okay. All right. So if you can remember, where did we leave off? Where did we leave off in the story of the Exodus? Well, they'd sent spies into the land. The spies brought back a bad report, and Israel says, "Forget it, we're not going." Right? That's where we left off. Okay. So let's talk about the period of wandering in the wilderness. By the way, I don't know why this had never struck me before. You know how I like little memory devices, okay? So Numbers chapter 13 is where the spies bring back their report, and Israel says, listens to the report of the 10 spies. Unlucky number 13. That's one if you want to use something superstitious to remember. Or there were 12 spies, and that's in chapter 13. Again, that's purely a number. If you want to think about that. All right, but nonetheless, we pick up with the period of the wandering in Numbers chapter 14. And as we've said, this includes the book of Deuteronomy and the first 5 chapters of Joshua. All right, so, all right, we're about to talk about the period of wandering in the wilderness. Well, Israel had rebelled. That's where we left off, right? Israel had said, we're not going into the land. So this begins with Numbers chapter 14. What was their punishment for refusing to go into the land?
They were sentenced to wander in the wilderness.
They were sentenced to wander in the wilderness.
Generation died off.
You cheated.
Tell you what, this younger generation, no respect at all.
Well, that was like word for word.
All right, so they were sentenced to wander. They were sentenced to wander in the wilderness. All right. Now, this is not a detail that's included in our bullet points. But what was the sentence? For how long were they going to wander in the wilderness? Allie, since you know so much, how long were they sentenced to wander in the wilderness?
I'm not cheating.
Oh, it's all right. You should know this. It's not been that long since you studied this in your Bible classes. How
40
long?
years.
40 years. All right. Why 40 years?
Why 40? Because 40 is a magic number in the Bible. No. I know. Generation.
Okay. Who said that? Did Ella say that?
Me, I said that.
Okay. And that's what would happen. That's wrong. And an entire generation of Israelites would die in the wilderness. That's exactly right. But why specifically the number 40? You're right, Allie. The number 40 is a Bible number that's used to indicate completeness or totality. And you know, you're right. 40 days and nights in the days of Noah, and 40 is kind of a special number. But why 40 specifically? There's a reason given in this story.
They spied out the land for 40 days, and so they were sentenced to 1 year for every day.
That's exactly right. All right. So the spies spied out the land for 40 days, and so they were sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for every day the spies were in the land. And so you have to remember, you have to think about what the Lord was communicating in that. Every year that passed as they wandered, well, all right, we're that's another year for one of the days the spies were in the land. The 40 years reminded them of what the spies had done in bringing back the bad report and their rebellion. It was intended to teach about their rebellion, and I think that's important. Excuse me. Diana didn't bring me a drink. I had to get my own. So 40 years for 40 days. Okay. Now, I think how I want to ask this question: when does the clock start on those 40 years? Is it 40 years from this point in Numbers 14?
No.
You're right. He's right. The 40 years actually goes back to when they left Egypt. Okay? And so essentially, to put it in modern terms, they get credit for time served. Right? In our judicial system, you hear that, right? Sentenced to time served. All right. So God gives them credit for the 18 months they've already journeyed in the wilderness. Does that make sense?
Is that like getting grandfathered in?
Yeah, something like that. And that's about 18 months, okay, from Egypt to this point at Kadesh Barnea. We can't be absolutely certain about that, but we can rough estimate about 18 months. And so it's another 38 and a half years from Numbers 14 until we get to the land in the book of Joshua. All right, everybody follow all of that? Make sense? Now, again, that's getting into some detail that, you don't necessarily have to, that we're not including in our bullet points right here. But when we talk about Israel wandering in the wilderness, well, that's what we're talking about. All right. As you turn in your Bible, you get the next kind of big events that you get to are the stories of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers chapter 16. And specifically, we think of fill in the blank of Korah. What's the story?
Rebellion.
Rebellion. All right. So this is where Korah and Dathan and Abiram rebel against the leadership of Moses and Aaron. The Lord, in response, not only punishing them, but in response to that rebellion, wanted to solidify in the minds of the people that Moses and Aaron were his appointed leaders. And so what sign did the Lord provide that signified their leadership? Not only killing Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, but what sign? I'll give you a hint. It was later added to the Ark of the Covenant.
That's when all the leaders or the elders were to bring their rods, and then Aaron's rod was chosen by the miracle.
That's right. It's Aaron's rod that budded. That's exactly right. All right. So again, we're just hitting kind of high points, big events in this period. If you fast forward to Numbers chapter 20, you have Miriam died. By the way, who was Miriam?
Aaron's sister.
Right, Moses and Aaron's sister. That's right. And in Numbers chapter 20 is an important chapter for another reason. And this time, not about Miriam, but about Moses and Aaron. This is kind of one of those chapters that's good to remember. It's kind of important.
It's about the water and the rock.
That's exactly right. This is the story of Moses and Aaron's sin, the waters of Meribah. All right. They are journeying from Sinai, Kadesh Barnea, and ultimately they're going to go to the land of Canaan. But they've got these years of sojourn, and so this is a period of wandering. And during this time,
Numbers 20.
During this time, you have the events when they passed by the land of Edom. That's important because Edom were their distant relatives, and there is the exchange between them. All right. That is also in Numbers chapter 20. And then as a consequence of Moses and Aaron's sin, what was their sentence? What was their punishment?
They were not allowed to enter into the promised land.
All right, they weren't going to enter the promised land. So that means if they're not going to enter the promised land, what's going to happen to Moses and Aaron during this time period?
Die.
They're gonna die.
They're both going to die. All right. And so Numbers chapter 20 actually ends with the death of Aaron. So most of this period of wandering gets passed over very, very quickly. All right. Most of the 40 years is passed by the time we get to by the time we get to the Numbers chapter 20 and even, and certainly Numbers chapter 21. In Numbers chapter 21, the people of Israel grow impatient because of this period of wandering. It was their own fault, but they grow impatient because of the journey. And as a consequence, the Lord sends certain creatures among them to punish them. Do you remember the story?
The snakes.
This is the story of the fiery serpents. That's right. That would bite the people, and whoever was bitten by a fiery serpent died. This is an important story because Jesus hearkens back to it in John chapter 3. And what connection is made between this story and Jesus in John chapter 3?
As the serpent was lifted up, so shall the Son of Man be lifted up.
That's exactly right. Okay, so Moses was told to make a bronze serpent, to put it on a standard or on a staff, to be held up before the people, and if they were bitten by a serpent, they could look at the bronze serpent and be healed. Just as the serpent was lifted in the wilderness, so will the Son of Man be lifted up. So that's an important story to remember, but also because it gives us an indication of what's going on with the people of Israel. They're growing impatient, right? And you only grow impatient if the journey is hard, if the journey is long. That ties into the 40 years. All right. Now, if you are making notes right now, you might even just put a little mark right here after that bullet point. The reason for that is, oops, sorry, I put that in the wrong place. Right here, this is what I meant. Because the bullet points that come from this point forward all come at the end of the period of the wandering. They're all getting ready to lead up to the period of the invasion and conquest of the land. Now, we can't put a definite timeline on this and say this happened at this point, or it was only so many months or so many years. We're not given that kind of chronology. But these events from this point forward are those as Israel gets closer and closer to the promised land, closer and closer to crossing the Jordan River and into the land of Canaan. So, actually, even though we've got 3 minutes left tonight, I'm going to stop there because that's a good breaking point. And so I'm just going to, I'm going to not only literally, but figuratively draw a line at that point, and we'll resume at that point next Sunday. I know that this is a lot, and I know that this section is a little bit tedious. I appreciate your patience with me in all of that, and I appreciate you hanging in there and continuing to study with me. So that's it. Anybody got any question? You've got about 2.5 minutes if you want to use it. If not, we'll sign off early.
Jeremy,
Yes, Alex.
I Googled it, so I know it must be true.
Oh, okay, good.
But someone estimated 50 days for the duration of the plagues. And as you mentioned, some of them actually give a time frame,
Right.
like 2 or 3 days of darkness or whatever,
Right.
and after
Right.
the second day, or so on and so forth. But I had never read or seen anything on that, but that was some man's estimation of
Okay.
how long those probably lasted.
Jeremy,
Yeah, was that on, if that was on Wikipedia, Alan, then we'll go with it. Tom?
When this study's over, can we get these like on slide, or not really slides, but just copies of this?
Yep.
I've got some gaps I need to fill in.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's in the works.
Okay.
All right. Well, it says less than a minute. Congratulations. You successfully used all of our time. You all have a great week. Thank you
Yep.
for studying with me. And join us on Wednesday night. Bye, everybody.